My mate Lessons from Anime said that it'd be interesting for me to do a video about how I break down series. That got me thinking about the idea, so I asked you, and over 100 people said they'd be interested in that. And here we are. Now, the first thing I want to make clear is that I'm not the kind of person who can just sit down, decide to make a video on a certain topic, start churning in my cranium, and poop out a hopefully high quality 20-minute video. Maybe there are some people who can do that, but I've spent a good amount of time in academia, and I certainly haven't met anyone who works that way. There's a moment before the Ubers match where Hiyori and Isagi reflect on Isagi's recent developments that in my opinion really captures the essence of the creative process. While Isagi may have seemed like a god to outside viewers, all he has been doing is steadily improving his pre-existing skill set. It's exactly the same with Raiden. Outsiders only see the final product, which may appear effortlessly elegant, but that's only because you don't see the process under the hood. So what I want to do here is give you some insight into my own creative process using examples from some of my past videos. I can't guarantee this will work for you. This is simply my method I discovered through trial and error. So to start very simply, how do I decide on a topic and delineate my subject matter? My ironclad rule for making a video is that at its core, it has to be about something I find beautiful or interesting, or maybe even just have strong opinions on. The reason for this is very simple. How can I expect my audience to care about something I don't care about myself? In most cases, the thing that gets me interested is a very specific moment that left some kind of impression on me. Let me give an example here. This is from my video on Kaiser and the Impossible. And as an aside, I hadn't realized at all that so many of you really seem to like that video. The seed for that project was planted back when I read chapter 242, the Ness backstory. This is one of my all-time favorite Blue Lock chapters. It deeply resonated with me as soon as it first released. So the first habit you have to get into if you have any ambitions to pick things apart, when something lights a spark in you, get into the habit of trying to articulate why it speaks to you and what purpose that moment has in the story. You don't need to have an immediate answer for either. I often don't, but the important thing is to start asking questions. Also, avoid anything like because it's hype, because it's touching or funny or whatever, like the plague, or even worse, because plot. These are non-answers, and those actively prevent you from engaging in actual critical reflection. Now, it's definitely the case that sometimes there just simply isn't any intention behind a creative decision, but I'd rather be charitable to an artist and assume there is, because, again, if you close off your mind, you'll never get interesting answers, whereas if you do try, you might get an answer that surprises you. So let's take chapter 242 as an example. Why did it appeal to me, and what is this scene doing? Up to this point, we've been shown a deeply toxic, dysfunctional relationship between Kaiser and Alexis Ness, but now we finally get to see why Ness remains so captivated by Kaiser despite being subjected to endless abuse. It's because Ness grew up in an environment that systematically belittled his fascination with the supernatural, all until he met someone who, with a single quote, "Do you believe in the impossible?" seemed to represent everything he idealized and empowered him in one fell swoop. This single moment suggested that at their best, there is a real chemistry between the two, one that isn't just superficial and based on them happening to know each other, but something deeper between their worldviews, their psyches, their everything, and that is deeply beautiful to me. Note that I'd been covering Blue Lock for almost a year by this point, and it had never entered my thick skull here until this moment that Kaiser's talk about the impossible was in any way significant or even interesting, even though he was introduced by defining himself against that fucking concept. I just have to say that I feel really stupid all the time for missing stuff that in hindsight is obvious and blatant. So anyways, chapter 242 made me interested in the idea of Kaiser as a symbol of the impossible, and it's only because I'm curious about it now that I start paying attention to how this idea gets developed throughout the NEL. This is also the moment where I need to talk about note-taking. If you actually want to get serious about writing something, get into the habit of jotting down half-baked ideas. I have tons of documents where I write down small little ideas or things I've noticed. For many of these, I have no idea if they'll ever go anywhere, But there have been plenty of times where something happened in this story that suddenly made sense of a number of my random observations, and voila, a video just came together. Also, the purpose of note-taking is twofold. Firstly, you're guaranteed to forget at least half of your insights, no matter how good your memory is. So if you don't want that to happen, write them down as soon as possible. But secondly, the act of making notes forces you to actually articulate something that usually starts as nothing more than a vibe. I find that one note often turns into 2 or 3 observations purely by the fact that I'm putting it to paper. So anyways, I found something truly beautiful in the moment of Kaiser asking Ness if he believes in the impossible, and I made some notes about that. With this, the concept of the impossible is now on my radar. That was reinforced even more in the very next chapter. Kaiser starts talking there about believing in the impossible as the way of weaklings, and saying that he succumbed to the impossible himself in the past. And more than that, he ties the meaning of his rose tattoo to his defiance of the impossible. Now, funnily enough, the moment I noticed this could be a potential video topic was actually when I happened to reread the match between Shido and Kunigami in the second selection. Shido has this line about not even knowing what impossible means and asking who decides what's impossible. Since I was interested in Kaiser as a symbol of the impossible at this stage, I found myself wondering how Shido's declaration stacks up to Kaiser's beliefs about the impossible. To be clear, I didn't have any definitive answers yet, but I did realize that it would be fruitful to compare the scene with Kaiser's view on the impossible and made notes accordingly. The final big moment for the video was when Kaiser's backstory dropped and it became clear that there was more to both Kaiser's meeting with Ness and Kaiser's mythologized account of the Blue Rose. And that led me to understand that we should call into question everything he said to Ness in the earlier flashback. I'm a big believer in waiting until the right time to drop a video. And for reasons that are hopefully obvious, I thought it would be best to wait until the conclusion of the PXG match for this project. So once that happened, I went over all my notes on Kaiser and the impossible. I reread every section of the story that had come to my attention previously, made even more notes, and then turned that into a video. One thing I hope you've noticed is that I never set out to do a Kaiser video or something like that. I've gotten plenty of requests over the years for dedicated videos on specific characters, but in my view, trying to make something in that way is a really terrible approach. Without a red thread to guide you, you'll likely just end up with an unfocused mess that's more of a summary than actual analysis. And as any person who has done a PhD can tell you, starting a project without properly knowing what you're trying to do is setting yourself up for a lot of frustration, wasted time, and incoherent writing. What I also really want to stress is that creating a good analysis requires a lot of time. The most important reason why I can't keep cranking out new videos is because I'm constantly rereading this edgy football comic. For every video I work on, I return to the relevant sections, and while doing so, I constantly make connections related to an entirely different topic that might also just be in the back of my mind. Like when I reread the Shido scene and connected it to Kaiser's speech about the impossible. Let me give you an even more extreme example of an analysis that could only exist because of constant rereading. I knew from very early on that I wanted to create a video about the U20 match because I hold the niche opinion that the U20 match is actually quite good. So let me give you a bit of an impression of how my core ideas for the U20 match came together and gradually developed and germinated. So from the first time I read the U20 match, I understood that what was at stake here is who gets to determine the future of Japanese football, mostly because the characters keep saying that bit out loud. So then I reread the chapters before the match commenced, and there I noticed Ego repeatedly talking about Blue Lock destroying the U20 team. After thinking about this a bit, I had a massive aha moment. I realized that this connects to the climax of the match, where Rin releases his impulses to hideously destroy his opponents. But what really made all this click in place for me was when I later reread chapter 8, where Ego exclaims that strikers are destroyers. That moment gained a lot of significance for me, given the fact that I was now thinking of the Blue Lock team in the U20 match as kind of a team of destruction. This is the moment where I put everything together. Strikers are destroyers, Blue Lock is creating the world's best striker, and Rin, Blue Lock's greatest player, becomes destruction manifested. And that coincides with the aims of Blue Lock in the U20 match to topple the established order and create a football revolution, just as a striker is supposed to do. But the real revelatory moment was when I then happened to reread Shido's second goal in the U20 match with all of this in the back of my mind. Shido states that creative instincts are basic programming in all living beings, and he compares scoring goals to conceiving children. And then, and this was really the clincher for me, Shido's goal directly segues into Egol talking about Shido having given birth to a new era for Japanese football. This is the moment that I realized that Shido's philosophy of creation is the polar opposite of Blue Lock's philosophy of destruction, and that the U20 team pulled ahead by formulating a response of sorts to Blue Lock's philosophy. Kind of independently, I'd started noticing a lot of references to the emergence of a hero in the U20 match. Since I knew that the U20 match was about the future of Japanese football, I realized that this hero figure served as a symbol of this promised rebirth. And of course, that's also something that's flagged in Chapter 1, because every single idea is always already flagged in Chapter 1 in Blue Lock. It's at this stage that I knew I had a basic framework for a dedicated video. Before that, I decided to still wait until things clicked together a bit more before starting to embark on this project. So once again, I reread the entire U20 match and picked up on a lot of additional details based on the observations I'd already made. I'm actually fairly certain that all my realizations about the significance of Rin's toys only came about during this reread, partially inspired by a Twitter thread I'd read a while back, kind of related to PXG stuff. So, long story short, just this bit of the U20 analysis required 6 different rounds of reading the manga. For most of these, I wasn't intentionally researching for a video on the U20 match. I just gradually accumulated observations until I felt like I had a solid foundation for a dedicated analysis. I didn't decide on one day to do a video on the U20 match, put on my thinking cap, and spew out an elegant thematic breakdown. And I don't think anyone can just do that and produce something that's actually good. Now, one final lesson that's really important to me in the creative process. It's okay to be wrong. In fact, you should embrace your mistakes instead of doubling down or looking away if you want to learn and improve. So the last example I want to discuss is a video that came together purely because I was stuck and I was wrong back in the past. You might be surprised that I'm talking about the trials of coming of age, which I still consider to be among the best Blue Lock analyses I've ever made. In case you haven't seen it, it's got perhaps the most elegant thesis of any of my long analysis videos. My basic claim is that the Neo-Egoist League, in terms of story structure, represents the moment of transition from amateurs to professional for the Blue Lock cast. This is then symbolized through a central metaphor of growing up, with each of its major characters' struggles involving the transition from child to adult. I already said this earlier, but when I put out a video like this, it's the result of an extensive creative process. I didn't step into the shower and start thinking, what's the underlying structural metaphor of the NEL? That's not a question that anyone would just randomly ask. Instead, this analysis that now seems almost effortlessly elegant might have been one of the most convoluted origin stories for any of my videos on the channel. The story of this video starts all the way back in my early phase of covering Blue Lock. During the early parts of the Ubers match, right before Barrow scored his first goal, I put out a video where I speculated on what might be the central themes of the match. Needless to say, almost everything from this video turned out to be completely wrong. The main prediction from this video, if my memory doesn't fail me, was that the central juxtaposition of the match would be between the Ubers growing up into adults, into professionals, and the childish infighting in Bastard München. And that would lead to a loss that would force BM to reflect and grow heading into the final match of the arc. It's obviously easy to laugh at this with the benefit of hindsight, but instead of becoming obsessed with being right or wrong, I now had an interesting question on my hands. Why does the manga introduce a master striker with a philosophy that revolves around learning to treat football as a job in a way that's very different from the values that Blue Lock normally puts on a pedestal? I'd offered an initial hypothesis, but that was proven wrong, and now I didn't really have a good answer anymore. But I was still curious about the issue nonetheless. So let's flash forward 30 chapters to the next flashback in chapter 242. I'm not kidding when I say I really like this chapter. It's been the direct inspiration for 3 separate videos. Most immediately, that chapter gave me the motivation to put together some of my thoughts about the purpose of Blue Lock's backstories. The short and dirty summary of that video is that all the backstories up to the U20 match are variations on a single message, that Japanese society is failing people who don't fit the mold. My suggestion then was that the Ness backstory was a German counterpart of this of sorts. Ness was the victim of a culture of rationality, just like how the Blue Lockers were victims of a collectivist culture. So all that is good and well, but there was a circle I just couldn't square at the time. Where do Yukimiya and Hiyori's backstories fit in with all of this? That felt like a giant gaping hole in my analysis, and I just couldn't find a good explanation at the time. So, once again, I had to shelve the question, but it was still somewhere in the back of my mind. Moving forward another 30 chapters now. This was during or right after Rin's backstory in the PXG match. I remember coming across a comment on Reddit from someone criticizing the match for being predictable because of the pattern with character backstories followed by them scoring a goal. I vehemently disagreed about this being bad writing, and there's almost nothing as good at getting my brain churning than someone being wrong on the internet. So that brought me back to my earlier question about the purpose of backstories in the NEL, and at that stage I made a casual observation that there seemed to be quite a lot of focus on early childhood in the NEL compared to the backstories of the previous parts of the story. That then reminded me of something I wrote in another old video of mine, my Bachira analysis. Back then, I'd observed that Bachira freeing himself from his monster in the 4v4 coincided with him reverting back to his childhood self. But then, in the NEL, he learned how to use his monster for positive growth and transformed from a child into an adult. In that video, I also talked about the importance of Bachira repeatedly being the first to do something or for whom a new philosophy just kinda clicked. I noted here that this was the case once again in the NEL. Here too, he was the first to find his place in a new environment. That's the moment when all my unanswered questions finally came together like pieces of a puzzle and my brain juices started overflowing. Why are there so many backstories in the NEL that focus on early childhood? Why did Snuffy talk about treating football as a job? Why did the NEL start with the character who'd most strongly been associated with childish impulses now growing up? I was beating myself over the head for only realizing this after the very last backstory of the NEL, given that all the hints had been there in plain sight. This was the moment I knew I had a concept for a really amazing video. So once again, I revisited the major character moments in the NEL from the perspective of growing up, made a ton of notes, and started writing. I can't stress enough how, at least in terms of the creative process, the coming of age videos were a freak accident. I never intended to put out 2 different NEL analyses. Up to a month before dropping that video, the only NEL analysis I'd conceived of was what would eventually become Visions of the World's Best. But as it turned out, a series of unanswered questions eventually came together to create a full arc analysis, which is a very cool thing when it happens. Okay, last thing. I got 2 questions from one of my viewers, Applezora. How do I decide what is important to keep and cut, and at what point do I start writing on a final draft? So last part first. I suspect I already kinda answered the second part, but just to be sure, it's when I articulated a central thesis or question and have some ideas about what story sections would be relevant to the topic. I don't always, however, have the conclusion completely figured out when I start writing. As an extreme example, I actually started my Manshine analysis with the focus being on how the match showed different ways to improve. It was only during the writing process that I had a big insight moment and reformulated the central thesis to the value of seeing different perspectives. Or my video on how Bastard München became a team. It started with a bit of a broad question about how the team dynamic developed over the course of the NEL. I only really figured out exactly what I wanted to say when I started rereading and came across the bit about Kaiser being the perfect embodiment of turning 0 into 1. That's kind of when I had a better structure for the video, really. Regarding the second question on what to cut, first of all, I can't stress enough that you really need to proofread anything before putting it out. As I already kind of made clear, It's very common for me that I only formulate my conclusion properly during the note-taking or writing process. That means that when I finish a script, I go over the whole thing again with these conclusions in mind. This is the phase where I take out anything that isn't really relevant to the main thesis. A big tell that you might need to cut or restructure something is when an argument or a paragraph doesn't really logically follow from anything else. And that also invariably means you might need to kill a darling or two every now and then. Fortunately, and this is probably by virtue of me constantly writing Blue Lock stuff, I often find that an observation that didn't really fit into a given video, but is interesting nonetheless, often finds its way into another project down the line. Just as an example here, in my Vision of the World's Best video, I point out a connection between Ness's fascination with things that don't exist. I swear, chapter 242 just keeps haunting me for some reason today. And Rin being haunted by Sai's phantom. That bit was actually originally in my draft for the PXG analysis, but no matter how much I moved it around, I just couldn't get it to click into place with the overall argument. That's when I realized that it wasn't really for this video, and also that it would make more sense in the context of a video on the significance of sight. And this scrapped section eventually became the cornerstone of my argument about how the PXG match fits into this NEL overarching metaphor. Anyways, back to proofing. The other added bonus of doing this is that I sometimes notice new connections because I'm looking at my earlier work with a fresh perspective. Most people get the majority of their ideas while writing. It's virtually never the case for me that I have a video perfectly planned out from start to finish before I even start drafting. One thing I do want to say about the process of elimination though. If you find yourself needing to cut a lot of material, that to me suggests that you started writing without a solid foundation. As said, you don't have to have your thesis perfectly formulated in advance. That's part of the writing process. However, if you start drafting with nothing more than the idea to do, let's say, a video on Barrow, you're not going to get a coherent essay. If that's the stage you're at, you should really stick to taking notes, not putting out a full draft. You're building a castle on sand, and that'll eventually end up being a massive waste of time if you want to make something that actually stands the test of time. So anyways, that's been me yapping about myself for half an hour or so. I've no idea if this was interesting or even relevant or useful, but there you go. And as always, I want to thank my generous €10 patrons: Alex Mackay, Jesus Cujo, Liam Dunseith, McJ Cave, Melody, and Orangey Legend. They're the ones who make sure I can keep up the channel without being evicted by my landlord. And until next time, slán go fóill.